Today's lesson is a little bit more abstract than what has come before it. Up until this point, we've talked a lot about the how of photography. We've covered techniques, gear, and hardware. But the wonderful thing about photography is that it's such a blend of both physical execution and artistic expression. And I call this the art and the craft of photography. And everything that we have learned up until now, the theory, the techniques, the gear, is the how of photography, the craft of photography. But the other part of photography, the art, is what we'll be focusing on over the next couple of days. The art of photography is the method to which we express ourselves. In many ways, it is the craft of photography that enables the art. It's the how that enables the why from a physical perspective in reality. But in many ways, also, it is the why that enables the how, in the sense that the why comes from the internal motivations and the reasons for doing photography and learning the how in the first place. And so you can see how things are quite cyclic between both the art and the craft of photography. Now, when I say that photography is all about light, when it comes to the art of photography specifically, to break it down further, it's actually all about how we see and interpret the light. So, actually, photography is all about your vision, your creative vision. And we all see the same things when we go to the same places, right? Two people standing next to each other in the same place see exactly the same thing in front of them. However, when I'm referring to vision, I'm referring to the abstraction of vision. Sure, in reality, what's in front of you, they're the same thing, but a skillful photographer sees the same scene as the person next to them, but envisions compositions within them. A photographer is able to discern portions of that same scene and is able to then turn that into an interesting photograph. A photographer is able to intentionally include elements within the compositions and have them say certain things that people who have not trained this vision just can't do. The art of photography is about the ability to look at a scene and use what's called visual language in order to express a message or a story using that language, and to do so in a remarkable, interesting, and perhaps even a timeless way. One of the interesting things about photography and art in general is that a piece of work always has an exchange of interpretation. A photographer taking a photo expresses something in the form of a photograph, to which the viewer then interprets that photo in some way. And whether or not this exchange is successful depends on the intent of the photographer and the experience of the viewer coming together. Art is not art unless it's shared. Art is an expression by the artist, yes, but without someone to interpret that expression, this expression goes unappreciated. By the very definition of the word art, like if you were to look it up in the dictionary, you'll notice that the paradigm of art has both the artist expressing and the viewer appreciating. Therefore, art is always a two-person process. And this relationship is interesting because that implies that it's the viewer's job to interpret what the artist is expressing. If the viewer is successful in interpreting the art piece, then there is a connection, a meaning, a value associated with that piece of art. The viewer is taken back to a time in their history they were reminded of by viewing this piece of art. They still remember the sights, they still remember the smells, they remember the time in their past that they see vividly. They feel an emotion, they understand it. There's a connection in some way, logically or emotionally. This art piece is successful in that it has moved the viewer in some way. Successful art does this. But what happens if the viewer doesn't appreciate or interpret the art? What if they don't know what's going on in that art piece and they don't understand it and they don't get it and they're not moved by it? Well, then there's no connection, there's no meaning, there's no value in that piece of art to them. Think of a time when you've gone to, let's say, an art gallery and someone's snarkily said, oh, I could have totally done that, or that looks like a 5-year-old painted it, or something along those lines. This person who made that comment doesn't have a connection with the art for what it is, and therefore doesn't place any value on it. And when there's no connection to a piece of art, there is no value in it for that person. That piece of art is unsuccessful for them, and so they mock it. This idea that art, even the same piece of art, can be successful or unsuccessful for different people is hugely important to understand because it doesn't necessarily mean that a piece of art is good or is bad. Good art is resonant art. For a piece of art to be resonant, it first needs to be successful in the sense that it is able to communicate to the viewer, that the photographer is about to explain their intent without speaking a literal word, right? Visual communication, visual expression. This is what art is. If you don't understand a piece of art first and foremost, you most certainly will not resonate with it. And if you don't resonate with it, then it's not going to be a good piece of art for you. Now, whether a piece of art is good or successful is largely dependent on the skill of the artist. And to make successful art that is expressive and resonant in photography, first requires having meaning and something to say, and then having the ability and the method in which to say it. Now, later on in day 18, we'll go through the idea of finding purpose in your art, which will give you the meaning and the motivation to then express yourself. As for having the method for which to express ourselves, well, we do this by the use of visual language. Now, the idea of visual language is a gigantic topic that, to be honest, warrants its own entire course, but we'll be covering it in detail tomorrow, and I'll introduce you to a resource that I think is absolutely essential in being exposed to and therefore building your visual vocabulary. But for now, we can say that a successful image is one that speaks successfully through the use of good visual language. Something I wanted to touch on before I end the lesson today, even though I would say it's a little bit of an advanced topic, is the idea of storytelling. You'll find this word thrown around a lot, not just in photography, but in any visual medium, really. And the problem with this word is that in photography, the elephant of the room is, how do you tell a story with images? Well, let me tell you straight up that there are many interpretations of how to understand the idea of storytelling in photography, and no particular method is more right than another. But I'm going to tell you mine so that at least you have a foundation, and as your journey of photography goes on, then you can see for yourself whether you agree with it or not, or whether you want to change or adapt your own version or interpretation. Giving you an explanation of this and having you aware of it at the start of your journey will do wonders for how you decide to compose your images and what you want to say with them down the line. Storytelling in general is, I think, a little bit misunderstood. And I think that comes from the literal interpretation of how stories are typically thought of. Typically you would think of a story being told through verbal explanation or perhaps through reading a written word. And you might have a classic story arc, the beginning, the middle, and the end, or a hero and a villain structure, or many of the other tropes that you know to be traditional stories. But in photography, storytelling is a little bit different. In photography and in other 2D visual mediums, storytelling is done mostly through visual interpretation. It's the job of the photographer to communicate and present their work in a particular way, which hopefully sparks an interpretation and understanding in the viewer. Think about when you pick up a physical photograph of maybe yourself or a loved one, or maybe someone with whom you have a lot of love towards. If this picture is very, very old, like decades old, there's a feeling. It doesn't necessarily matter exactly what is going on in the photo, but what is in it takes you back to that time and that place in that space. You remember what you were doing. You remember what it felt like at the time. You remember the sights and the sound and the smells. There's emotion connected with that photograph. And regardless of whether it's been shot by an award-winning photographer or your grandma on an expensive camera or on a camera phone, it doesn't matter. That photo makes you feel something. And it's this feeling that is the cornerstone to storytelling in photography. It's the fabric of interpretation and therefore the genesis of resonance. They say that a photo is worth 1,000 words, and that really comes from being able to recount and describe the emotions and the feelings that are being drummed up when the viewer views a successful image. A successfully told story in a photograph transports the viewer to a metaphorical place. Maybe that's a time in their past that the photo reminds them of. Maybe it's a place in the future that they want to go to. Maybe it's a good vibe. Maybe it's a bad one. Maybe it inspires them to travel to a place in the photo and it reminds them of all the wonderful travel moments they've had with their loved ones. Maybe they get lost in the detail and become mesmerized by the subject and fantasize about the story. The stories that we know and the stories that we tell ourselves are always different for everyone, always, all the time, no exception. You could be sitting at the movies next to your best friend watching the same movie and walk out of that movie with the same conclusion about the same story and the same opinion, but how you got there and constructed there and interpreted each scene moment to moment will never be the same. The role of the photographer in an image is to provide a message to the viewer, a suggestion of how to interpret the image, almost like a sensible default, right? Something that is so plain and obvious that, of course, you would interpret it in this way. The role of the viewer in an image is to understand and interpret by infusing emotion, meaning, feeling, their experiences, and most importantly, if the image is a successful one, value. The most successful images allow the viewer to infuse these things. The idea of how to storytell in photography then is a matter of, coming back to what we were talking about before, resonance. Why do you create the things that you create? What do you want to say? And then how do you want to say it? In a singular image, your job as a photographer is to create what I call insinuated stories. Perspectives that are presented but deliberately left open with an interpretation, an invitation to the viewer to create their own story and their own association and their own meaning and value from. It's your job as a photographer to give people the chance to be able to interpret their own stories in their own minds when they look at your work. And we do this by combining the intention of why we take the photograph with visual language. And again, we'll cover both of these ideas in more days to come, but know that your intention, whether that is to document or recount your experience or to deliberately craft a message or to express some kind of beauty, all of these things are very much important in addition to what kind of language you use to express these ideas. And while this might seem kind of hard to do in a single image, and it is, in photography, we often also have the opportunity to use multiple images, and the more images that we have at our disposal, the more of a nuanced story that we can tell. One example of how you could tell a story with intention through multiple images is through the idea of a traditional narrative arc, or a story with a beginning, a middle, and an end. So for example, if you wanted to tell the story of your first time visiting a new location you're traveling to or have discovered, then you could have, let's say, shot 1 is a tight shot of you packing your bags. Shot 2 is a medium shot of you on the train on the way to your destination. Shot 3 might be perhaps a wide establishing shot of the general area you're now in. Shot 4 then might be a detail shot of something that you've seen along the way to enrich the experience and pull the viewer in. Shot 5 might be a medium shot to show the destination. And then shot 6, the final payoff shot at the end of your journey, the hero shot at the end. In this kind of straightforward example, you're deliberately recounting your experiences of doing something and you're hand holding the viewer, which is just as valid a form of storytelling as it is trying to stir up emotions within them as well. One thing I do want to point out though is that not all photos need to focus on story or messaging exclusively. You don't need every single image to tell a story, and having a good story doesn't necessarily constitute a good image. Of course, that won't stop viewers from creating one anyway, but the point here is that you don't need to put that much pressure on yourself to be constantly, intentionally creating stories every single time that you press the shutter. The art of documenting even the most mundane of daily life is just as valid as triggering the imagination and emotion of a viewer through something epic or playful. All right, today's assignment doesn't involve a camera. Instead, it's all about immersion and drenching that subconscious with inspiration. And the idea is simple. During the course of an hour, Scour the internet and find images that you like. Save them and then add them all into a single place. Maybe you print them all out and you stick them on a wall somewhere, or maybe you put them as a collage together on like Photoshop or something, or maybe you have them all on a Pinterest board. Whatever medium you decide, I want you to make sure that you can see this collection of images every single day for as long as you can. Some ideas around this might be to surround your bathroom mirror with inspiring images, or maybe the back of a door, or even next to your coffee machine, or even on the desktop of your computer as the wallpaper, or maybe the wallpaper of your phone, wherever the place, make it so that you can see it every day. Why? Well, I believe that quality input equals quality output. And over the course of your time in photography, the very simple act of viewing thousands and thousands of images allows you to make creative associations in your mind, even if you aren't consciously doing so. The more images that you see, the more patterns you'll be able to realize, even more so when they're images that you like for one reason or another. And the idea is to saturate your brain and your subconscious with as many good photographs as possible. And this will do wonders for seeing what works and what doesn't, and what is good and what is not, and so on and so forth. This is a really good practice to do regularly, even outside of this course. So I really highly recommend that you consider doing so. Oh, and bonus points if you can, sit in front of all of these images and write down for yourself exactly why it is that each one of those images is good according to you. What makes them good? Try to answer that question with your current level of knowledge and then return to that question after the end of this course, and I assure you that your answer will be different. All right, I'll see you tomorrow.